The first sound was faint 3 slow taps against the wood, spaced like whoever stood outside wasn't sure they ought to be there at all. The wind had been whining through the pines since morning, but this was different, deliberate. I stood by the stove knife still in hand from skinning rabbits, wondering who would ride this far in January, or if they'd even come on a horse. A second knock came lighter still, and I crossed the room, my eyes on the rifle leaning against the wall. When I pulled the door open, the cold came in like a shove, and there she was, a young woman with snow crusting her hem and a child bundled tight against her shoulder. Neither of them moved until I stepped back. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. I'm Eli Harland, and I've been on my own here in Dustmere Valley for the better part of 4 years. I grew up trailing cattle across dry country, sleeping under canvas. When I was lucky, under stars, when I wasn't. My folks raised me on plain values: work honest, speak true, help. A neighbor when you can. Out here, there's no one to see if you're keeping to that, but I still try. The cabin I live in came up board by board from my own hands, a place I thought I'd share with my wife and the baby girl we had. But the valley's winters are long and hard, and that second year took more than we could carry. Our daughter's grave sits just beyond the ridge where the snow drifts slow, marked by a red pine. By spring, my wife had gone too, saying the silence was more than she could bear. Since then, I've kept to my own company. My world's been the trap lines through the timber, the steady ring of an axe, the thin smoke from my stove curling into still air. I trade in town when I have to, but I don't linger. The place has a way of reminding a man of what he's lost. The folks there talk rail money and land sales like it's gold spilling from the hills, while I measure worth in a full woodpile and meat enough to last the week. My life's been narrow by choice, steady, because it has to be with nothing left that could be taken from me. Or so I believed. That night in January, the snow had fallen for 2 days straight, thick enough to hush the woods clear to the creek. I'd just been thinking about cutting a new trail come morning when those knocks came. Whoever was on the other side hadn't called out, hadn't tried the latch, just waited in the dark. My hand went to the door, and I knew that once it opened, nothing in this cabin would be quite the same again. Miriam stood just inside the threshold, her shoulders sagging under the weight of wet cloth and cold air. She didn't look around, only moved toward the stove, as if it were the first thing she'd seen in days. The child in her arms was light enough that when she set her down, the girl's limbs hardly stirred the blanket. I took 2 folded quilts from the cupboard and set them where they'd catch the heat. The fire had dropped to embers, so I worked it back to life until the flames curled through the fresh wood. She sat cross-legged beside the girl, rubbing small hands between her own, her shawl slipping from one shoulder. Her eyes stayed fixed on the child, even when I set a tin cup of water beside her. Name, I asked. Her gaze lifted just enough. Miriam Doyle. This here's Annie. She's 4. Fever's passed, but she hasn't said a word in weeks. We've been walking 3 days from Coyote Ridge. She hesitated, then told me her husband died 2 winters back, leaving debts no one would forgive. Work dried up. Men made offers she wouldn't take. When Annie fell sick, she went to the church. They told her to pray harder. I ladled stew into a bowl and set it by her knee, then fixed a smaller one for the girl. Miriam ate slow, one eye on the door, as if expecting to be told to leave. When the bowl was empty, she said, I don't have anything. Not even a bedroll. But I'll work for what we eat. I don't need charity. I don't give it, I told her. I brought out a spare cot from the back and set it near the fire. She said nothing more, only settled the girl in close and pulled the quilt over both of them. That night, I stayed on the far side of the room, my cot near the door and rifle. The wind moved in the eaves, and now and then Annie coughed softly in her sleep. Miriam didn't stir much, her arm draped over the girl like a tether. The red glow from the stove lit her profile younger in rest, but drawn all the same. I kept the fire steady until morning. At first light, the snow had stopped, leaving the world outside heavy and white. The air in the cabin was cold enough to see breath. I stirred the coals until they caught and set a pot of oats to simmer. Miriam woke to the smell, her eyes darting to the girl before anything else. Annie's breathing was even, her hair a tangle across the pillow. "Still snowed in?" she asked. "Mostly." "Path to the barn's clear, but town will have to wait a week." She took the bowl I handed her, the steam easing the stiffness in her hands. When Annie stirred, Miriam was there in a blink. "You're warm now," she whispered. The girl didn't answer, only drank from the cloth her mother pressed to her lips. I took my coat from the peg. "Going to the traps," I said. Miriam asked for a spare bucket so she could fetch snow for washing. When I pointed to the shelf, she stepped outside with no flinch at the cold. By midday, she had a pot of water warming for laundry, and the floor swept. I came back with 2 rabbits, which I dressed at the table. She cleaned the shelves without being told, moved, with the quiet purpose of someone trying to earn her keep. That evening, she fed Annie soup in slow spoonfuls. "She's holding it down," Miriam said. "Might be turning a corner." I sat nearby, cleaning my rifle. The air between us stayed easy if spare. As the wind picked up, Miriam tucked Annie in and paused by the stove. I meant what I said that first night she told me, eyes on the fire. I'm not expecting anything. I just didn't know how else to ask. I told her she didn't have to offer. She nodded and turned to her cot. In the dark, a thin voice said, "Ma." Miriam sat up fast. "I'm here." Annie only turned toward her mother's voice, but the sound filled the room more than the fire. Over the next days, the pattern set in without plan. One of us saw to the fire at dawn, the other fetched water. When I brought in wood, I noticed her boots too big, patched with one of my old laces. By the 3rd morning, she had a space by the stove for her shawl and washing rag. Annie followed me with her eyes when I worked, watching my hands split kindling or skin game. One clear morning, I found Miriam slicing onions into the pot. "Annie's starting to sweat through at night," she said. "That's a good sign." She looked surprised to hear it from me. We spoke little, but she told me more of her husband. Week off and gone, and never one to stand up for her. "Annie remembers the smell of whiskey more than his voice," she said. I didn't press further. That afternoon, she hummed while peeling potatoes. It was quiet, tuneless, and I let it be. After supper, she sewed a button on one of my shirts without asking. When she handed it back, I said, "Thanks." She asked once if I'd always lived alone out here. Wasn't the plan, I told her, but it's what happened. One night, Annie woke coughing. Miriam was up in an instant, pressing her palm to the girl's forehead. "Warm, but not bad," she said. She stayed by her through the night, wiping her face with a damp cloth. I kept the fire fed until the room was steady with heat. By morning, Annie's cheeks held a little color, and the cabin felt less like a place just for enduring winter. The thaw came slow. One morning, Miriam spotted Annie watching her from the cot, eyes alert. "You hungry?" she asked. Maybe the girl whispered. Miriam stood quick to warm oats, adding a pinch of salt. When I came in from splitting logs, Annie was upright with the bowl in her lap. "She asked for it," Miriam said. I nodded and told her the snow was softening, maybe enough to try the road soon. She asked if it would be safe for her to go to town. I didn't answer outright, only said what I could find there if I went a needle, another blanket. She asked if the place was mine. I told her I'd built it after my wife left. When she asked what happened, I said she left after our daughter died. "I almost didn't open the door to you," I admitted. Miriam looked at me then and said, "But you did?" That afternoon, she found a tin box among the linens and set it back without a word. Near sundown, I came in from the path with my hands red from cold. She'd poured hot water in a basin for me. We took our supper by the fire, her mending her shawl, Annie with a cloth doll made from one of my shirts, me sharpening a blade. Then came a knock, 2 firm raps, and stillness. I reached for the rifle. Miriam pulled Annie closer. Outside stood a woman in fine furs, her horse tied at the post, her voice saying my name like it was years ago. She glanced past me into the room. I stepped out and closed the door most of the way. The talk was short and low. When I came back in, the cold had followed me. "Someone from town," I said. "Doesn't matter." But I saw Miriam's eyes, and I knew the quiet we'd found wasn't beyond reach of the world outside. The woman's visit hung in the air through the night. Miriam lay with her arm over Annie, her eyes open long after the fire settled to a glow. By morning, frost clung to the window panes, and the cabin felt close. I was already up feeding kindling to the stove when she stirred. She moved quiet, careful not to wake the girl, then wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped toward the table. "She from your past?" Miriam asked, her voice low. I didn't turn from the stove. We were close once. She wasn't expecting to see anyone here. Miriam poured herself a tin cup of pine bark tea, letting the steam rise between us. "Did she know your wife?" "No. She didn't know I had one," I said. She studied me for a moment. "You think she'll come back?" I looked over at her then. "If she does, she won't knock next time." The words settled without answer. I gathered my coat and net to check the stream. "I won't be long," I told her. She met my eyes briefly. "If something happens, I know how to use a rifle." I nodded once and stepped into the cold. The snow along the trail was thinning patches of dark earth showing through. The ice on the stream's edge was breaking enough to take fish if I was patient. When I came back, I carried 2 trout and a small parcel wrapped in paper. Miriam wiped her hands on a cloth when she saw it. "You went to town halfway," I said. "Met the stage driver at the fork. He passed this along." Inside was a spool of strong thread, a sewing needle, and a folded piece of deep blue wool. "For Annie," I said, glancing toward the cot where she slept. "Something warmer." Miriam's hand ran over the fabric. "You didn't have to." I know. That evening after the girl was settled, Miriam stepped outside for the first time since coming here. The night air was sharp, the moon pale over the ridge. I followed a few minutes later, closing the door behind me. She kept her gaze on the dark woods. That woman. She looked inside and didn't like what she saw. Me. Annie. Us here. I let her words rest in the cold. She's always liked things simple. "Empty," I said. Miriam turned toward me then. "You ever think about sending us away?" "I did that first night," I admitted. "Thought it'd be easier. Now I don't think that anymore." Her eyes searched mine for a long moment before she stepped closer, brushing my arm with her hand. "I'm not here to take something from you. I just need a place where my daughter can sleep without fear." "You've got it," I said. We stood like that until the wind moved between us. I pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, my hand brushing her collarbone before I stepped back. Inside, she passed my chair on her way to her cot and leaned down just enough to kiss me. It was brief, unhurried, but it stayed with me long after she lay down. By morning, the frost on the glass had turned to beads of water. Miriam was tending the fire when I came in from the barn, my boots wet to the ankles. She handed me a towel. Annie sat curled on the cot, watching the steam rise from her bowl. She'd been humming softly again, the sound thin but steady. I finished my breakfast and stepped back outside to chop what frozen logs were left. Miriam stood in the doorway for a while, her arms folded before turning inside. When I came back in, Annie was on the floor tracing shapes in a patch of ash. "He's nice," she whispered to her mother. Miriam froze in place. "What was that? He's nice. He keeps you warm. Can we stay?" Miriam glanced toward the door where my axe struck wood in a slow, steady rhythm. "We're safe here. That's what matters." Annie's voice lowered again. "But do we have to leave later?" Miriam didn't answer right away. "I don't know yet, sweetheart." Later that afternoon, I was at the table oiling my rifle while Miriam mended her skirt. A shadow passed across the window. My hand stilled. A knock followed louder than the last time. I stood and opened the door without hesitation. The man outside was tall coat buttoned to the throat hat low over an unshaven face. He looked me over with a familiarity I didn't like. "Eli Harland," he said. "Didn't expect you to answer so quick." "You got a reason to be here?" I asked. "Just passing through. Heard you were still breathing out here. Thought I'd see for myself." His eyes shifted past me to where Miriam stood behind the table, her arms tight around Annie. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Miriam Doyle. Figured you'd have crawled back to Coyote Ridge by now." Miriam's voice was flat. "What do you want, Will?" He stepped forward, but not across the threshold. "Heard you were alone. Thought you might be looking for help. Or a man." "I'm not," she said. His gaze slid back to me. "This one giving you shelter or something else?" My tone sharpened. "You came here to talk, say it. If not, turn back down the path." He smirked, always playing guard dog for strays. I stepped out onto the porch, close enough to see his breath in the cold. "One more word like that, and you'll be bleeding in the snow." He raised his hands a little. Didn't mean offense, but his eyes said otherwise. I shut the door behind me, leaving Miriam inside, and we spoke low in the yard for a minute before he turned and walked off toward the ridge. When I came back in, she was still by the table. "Who was he?" I asked. "Used to work with my husband. After Cal died, he came around thinking I owed him something. When I said no, he told folks I was sleeping my way through the county." Annie clung to her mother's skirt, her eyes wide. "I hoped if I ran far enough, he'd stop looking," Miriam said. I set the rifle back in its place. "He won't come back." She looked at me sharply. "How can you know that? Because I told him what happens if he does." Her jaw tightened, studying me in the firelight. "You don't even know me. I know enough." The room stayed quiet for several breaths. That night, Annie fell asleep early. I sat near the stove while Miriam moved to the table. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door," she said. "You didn't. It found you long before this." She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "I've never had a man protect me without expecting something back. I offered myself that first night. You remember?" I nodded. "Still never asked again. I didn't take you in for that," I told her. "I took you in because I wasn't going to let a child die on my doorstep." Her voice was quiet. "And me?" I hesitated. "I wasn't going to watch you freeze either." She stood slowly, stepped close enough to touch my face, her fingers brushing my cheek before falling away. "I don't need your bed to feel safe," she said. "But I want to be close to you if you'll let me." I rose my hand, finding her jaw, my thumb tracing the edge of her cheekbone before I kissed her. It was steady, without rush, meant only to show she wasn't being used. Her shoulders eased just enough to notice. That night we lay together under a blanket by the fire, fully clothed, sharing only the heat between us. Outside, the snow continued to melt. Inside, something else began to settle, something neither of us named. By the time the first light pushed over the ridge, the snow had softened enough to leave dark patches in the yard. I woke with Miriam's back against my chest, her breathing slow and even. Annie was still asleep on the cot, one arm curled under her head. I eased myself up, stoked the fire, and set water to heat. The room smelled faintly of wet wood and the fish we'd cooked the night before. Miriam stirred soon after, gathering her hair back with one hand as she stepped to the stove. She set oats to simmer without asking if I wanted any. We ate with the quiet ease that had grown between us. Annie took her time with her bowl, but she finished it, her cheeks no longer so pale. Afterward, Miriam cleared the table and began folding the blankets that had been piled near the fire. Later in the morning, I went out to check the traps along the north trail. The air was warmer, carrying the scent of damp pine, and the snow in the shaded hollows was giving way to mud. I found one rabbit and a squirrel, enough to keep us for another day or two. When I came back, Miriam was mending one of Annie's dresses with the deep blue wool I'd brought. The needle moved steady in her hands, and the girl sat nearby drawing shapes in the ledger's blank pages. In the afternoon, I carried a few planks from the shed to patch the roof over the woodpile. Miriam stepped out and held the ladder while I worked her shawl pulled close against the breeze. "You miss Coyote Ridge?" I asked from above. She shook her head. "Nothing there for me but bad memories and mean faces." She hesitated before adding, "I've got a sister somewhere west. Last I heard, she left the farm before I married Cal. She said I was a fool for it." I passed her a nail without comment. When the work was done, we stood for a moment in the open yard. The snow melt trickled in the ditch by the fence, and a crow called from the bare branches beyond the barn. Inside, Annie had gathered her charcoal and scraps of paper on the table, her lips moving in a faint hum as she sketched. Miriam set her sewing aside and joined her, sounding out a few letters. "We'll make a table for her by the window," I said. Miriam looked up surprised. "You mean that I wouldn't have said it if I didn't?" That evening, the three of us sat near the stove, Annie with the doll she'd made from one of my shirts, Miriam darning the elbow of my coat, and me running a whetstone along my knife. The sound of it was steady, the kind of rhythm that settles a room. Outside, the wind had gone still, and a thin slice of moon rode low over the ridge. It was Miriam who broke the quiet. "I've been thinking about staying. Not just through the thaw." I met her eyes across the fire. "You already are?" She shook her head. "I mean for good. I don't want to leave in spring. Not ever." I set the knife aside. "Didn't think you would." She drew in a slow breath. "I didn't come here looking for a man. I came looking for mercy. You gave me more than that." I reached over and took her hand. "I'm not good with promises, but I'll protect you and Annie as long as I breathe." She didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "That's all I want." We sat like that until the fire sank low, the only sound the soft crackle of pine. By late March, the last of the snow clung only in the shadows. The stream near the ridge ran clear and fast again, carrying the sound of moving water down to the cabin. Birds had returned to the pines, their calls sharp after the long quiet. I built a second chair without saying who it was for. Miriam made space for it beside the stove, dusting it as though it had always been there. Annie was stronger now. She spent her mornings at the table by the window, practicing letters in the ledger, while Miriam helped her sound out words. In the afternoons, she trailed me outside carrying small pieces of wood to the stack or watching while I set a snare. I'd catch her studying my hands the way she once had from across the room. But now, there was curiosity instead of wariness. One evening, Miriam opened the trunk at the foot of the cot and found a wooden horse worn smooth from years of use. She turned it over in her hands, then carried it to Annie. "This was someone else's," once she said gently. "It's yours now if you want it." Annie looked at me, waiting. I nodded, and she hugged it to her chest, not letting go, until she fell asleep. The next day, Miriam spotted a rider coming along the south path. She stepped inside and reached for the rifle by the door. Annie went under the table with her blanket. I stepped out onto the porch, cradling the rifle, but not aiming it. The man who drew up was Sheriff Tom Calder from Ash Grove. His horse lathered and a leather satchel tied behind the saddle. "Eli Harland," he called. I stepped down into the yard. "That's me." He swung down from the saddle. Got word you've got company. A woman and child. Stage driver said a man named Will Palmer's been asking about her stirring talk. My jaw tightened. He came once. I sent him off. The sheriff glanced toward the cabin. You think he'll come back? I told him what happens if he does. He nodded slowly. Then I'll leave it there. But if she wants her name cleared, she ought to send word to Coyote Ridge. Let them know she's alive and that her husband's debts don't tie her to anyone. I said I'd tell her. He mounted up, settling in the saddle. You've always kept to yourself, Eli. Just be sure you know what you're protecting now. I do, I said. When I went back inside, Miriam was standing near the table, her arms folded. He said I should write to Coyote Ridge, she said. Clear my name. I asked if she wanted to. I don't care what they think of me, she replied. I do, I told her. If it means no one else comes looking. That night she wrote the letter. It was one page, her hand unsteady but firm. She didn't explain herself or ask anything, only stated she was alive, owed nothing, and that she and her daughter were making a life where no one owned them. I rode into Ash Grove the next morning and sent it. When I returned, Miriam was in the yard, sleeves rolled, clearing a strip of ground along the fence. She handed me a seed pouch. Help me, she said. We worked until dusk, the soil under our nails. Annie sitting nearby braiding grass into a ring. As the light faded, Miriam rested her hand on my chest. I think I'm with child, she said. I stilled, then wrapped my arms around her. There was no talk of fear, no questions of what came next. We already knew. Spring settled into Dustmere Valley without a rush, the kind of change you noticed first in the smell of the air before you saw it in the grass. The earth along the fence line turned dark and rich, holding the neat rows Miriam and I had cleared together. A thin green haze had started to push through, and Annie had marked each patch with small stones she'd painted from the creek bed. The cabin didn't look the same as it had in winter. Curtains hung fresh in the windows, the second chair stood beside the stove, and the shelves held jars scrubbed clean and ready for the next season's fill. Miriam moved slower now, though not from weariness. Her hand often rested on her belly without thought as she worked. The child wasn't showing yet, but she knew, and so did I. I found myself adding small things without speaking on it, an extra pillow on the cot, a folded blanket within her reach, carrying every bucket of water myself. Annie noticed too. One evening, she asked her mother if the baby would cry much. Miriam told her maybe, but not forever. Annie thought about that, then set the wooden horse on the windowsill and said it had better be strong. I'd been thinking on the space in the cabin for weeks. One night I told Miriam I could build a second room before the weather turned again, something for her and the children. I can move my cot to the barn once it's warm enough, I said. She looked up from her sewing. You're not sleeping in the barn, Eli. You built this place. We'll make room without pushing you out. Her tone left no place for argument, so I nodded and sat beside her, picking up the cloth she'd set down. As the days lengthened, we spent more time on the porch in the evenings. The frogs had started calling from the creek, and the scent of thawed earth carried up from the lower ground. Annie would fall asleep in the second chair, her head against Miriam's arm, while we watched the sky turn from gold to deep purple. One night, Miriam asked if I thought trouble might come again. I told her no. She studied my face. What if you're wrong, then they'll find I've got more to protect now, I said. She didn't look away when she asked. Even with me like this, a child, already another on the way, a past that could knock at the door, my answer didn't take long. Yes. Her eyes glistened, though she blinked it back. You've been good to me, Eli. I don't expect it. I'm not doing it out of kindness, I said. Then why? She waited, and I told her plain, because I love you. The words caught her still, not because she hadn't felt it, but because I'd said them out loud. She answered soft, I love you too. Didn't think I'd say that again. I took her hand and held it between mine. You won't have to say it alone. A week later, I rode into Ash Grove for nails and boards. In my coat pocket, I carried something else, plain silver, nothing fancy but solid. When I set it on the table that evening, she looked from it to me. "If you still want to stay," I said. "You sure?" she asked. "Never been more," I told her. She slipped it on both hands, holding my face for a moment. "Then let's do this right." The following Sunday, we walked to the edge of the field where the frost no longer held. No church stood out here, no minister, no gathering but the wind through the grass and the slow creak of the porch behind us. Annie stood between us and placed a sprig of blooming sage in Miriam's palm. "For luck," she said. We joined hands. No vows were written down, only the words that mattered. "I'll stay," Miriam said. "I already have," I answered. From that day, the work felt different. It wasn't just keeping a roof over our heads or food on the table. It was building for more than myself. The fence along the south pasture needed mending, so I set to it, planning where a milk cow might graze come summer. Miriam tended her rows, and Annie carried water from the creek in a small pail she could manage on her own. The cabin felt lived in now, not simply occupied. Late one afternoon, I was repairing a hinge on the barn door when I heard hoofbeats on the road from the ridge. I stepped into the yard, wiping my hands on my trousers. The sun was low enough to cast the rider in silhouette, but as he drew closer, I saw the badge on his vest. Sheriff Calder pulled up near the porch, his horse blowing from the climb. He swung down slow, his face set in a way that told me this wasn't a neighborly call. "Eli," he said, tying off the reins, "we need to talk." Sheriff Calder stood in the yard, dust still clinging to his boots from the long ride. He kept his hat, low eyes narrowing toward the cabin before he spoke again. "It's about a man asking questions in Ash Grove. Says he's looking for a woman and a girl." The way his voice carried left no doubt who he meant. Miriam stepped into the doorway, Annie just behind her skirt. Calder gave her a slow nod, then looked back to me. Name he gave was Harlan Briggs. Tall gray at the temple's scar over his left cheek. Came in from the rail spur 3 days ago. Miriam's breath caught, though she didn't speak. I'd never heard the name, but her face told me enough. I asked Calder what Briggs had said. Not much. Claimed they were family. But when I pressed, he got cagey. Folks in town didn't care for his manner. Stays at the boarding house, spends his evenings at the saloon asking after strangers. He shifted his weight, glancing at Miriam. "If this is trouble, I can post a deputy near the ridge." Miriam shook her head quick. "No. That will just stir things. He'll know I'm here if the law comes sniffing." I looked at her, waiting for more. She swallowed hard. Harlan Briggs was my husband's partner, the one who sold me off when debts came calling. He'll want to finish what he started. The wind picked up, pulling at the edge of her shawl. Calder's jaw tightened. "I can't run a man out of town without cause, Eli. But I can keep eyes on him." I told him that would do for now. He mounted up, the leather creaking under his weight, and left without another word. Inside, Miriam kept her back to me as she set a kettle on the stove. "You didn't tell me about him before I said." She didn't turn. I thought he'd be far away by now. Men like him don't let go. I was hoping I'd be wrong. Annie slipped into the corner, sensing the change in the room. I set a hand on Miriam's shoulder. "We'll handle it. Together." That night, I sat on the porch long after they'd gone to bed, watching the dark road from the ridge. Every sound carried an owl from the cottonwoods, a distant coyote. I kept my rifle across my knees, not because I thought he'd come that night, but because I needed the weight of it there. The next afternoon, I rode into Ash Grove under the pretense of collecting feed. The saloon smelled of whiskey and sweat voices low in the dim light. I spotted him at once, tall, wearing a coat that had seen better years, a jagged line pulling his left cheek taut when he spoke. He was leaning on the bar, talking to a man I didn't know. I took a table near the back and waited. When he finally noticed me, his gaze lingered a moment too long. He didn't smile. Instead, he drained his glass, set it down slow, and walked out. I followed at a distance, keeping to the storefront shadows. He went toward the boarding house, but halfway there he stopped in the street and turned as if he'd heard something behind him. His eyes scanned the dark, then he moved on. I didn't speak to him that day, nor the next. But on the third morning, Calder found me at the smithy. "He's been asking about your place," the sheriff said. "Wanted to know how far it was from the ridge if you had help working the land." That was enough for me. I rode home hard, the wind stinging my face. Miriam was in the garden, her shawl pulled tight. She saw me and stood straight. "He's coming, isn't he?" I told her yes. We spent the rest of the day making sure the gates were barred and the back door braced. Annie gathered her toys without complaint, as if she knew this was not a time for questions. When night fell, we kept the lamps low. Every creak of the boards sounded louder than it ought to. Somewhere near midnight, I heard the faint rhythm of hoofbeats on the ridge road. I moved to the window heart, steady but ready. A single rider paused at the bend, the moon catching the pale line of a scar across his cheek. He stayed there a long moment before turning his horse and vanishing into the trees. We didn't sleep much after that. And come morning, as I stood on the porch, with the sun just breaking over the far hills, I knew the waiting was almost over. It was near sundown when I saw the rider again, just a dark shape on the ridge against the fading light. He didn't move toward the cabin, only sat there still as the pines around him. The air had that dry, brittle chill that comes before a hard frost, and every sound carried far my own breath, the soft creak of the porch rail beneath my hand. Miriam stepped out quietly, shawl drawn tight. "Is it him?" she asked. I nodded once. Annie stayed inside, peeking through the curtain just enough to see. The rider turned his horse at last and began down the slope slow and steady, as though he owned the ground he crossed. By the time he reached the yard, I'd stepped down off the porch. His horse stopped a few paces short, nostrils steaming in the cold. The man swung down his boots, sinking into the frost-hardened dirt. That scar on his cheek caught the last scrap of daylight. "You're Eli Carter," he said, voice low but carrying. "I've been told you've got someone here belongs to me." I kept my eyes on his, not giving him the satisfaction of looking back toward the cabin. "You've been told wrong," I said. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Miriam knows me. We got unfinished business. I aim to settle it." I told him he'd settle nothing here, not tonight, not ever. He shifted his coat aside just enough to show the handle of a pistol at his hip. Before he could say more, I heard the soft crunch of hooves behind him. Sheriff Calder rode into the yard, his deputy Frank Dobbins right behind. Calder dismounted slow, every movement measured. "Evening, Briggs," he said. "Heard you might be heading this way. Thought I'd pay a call." Briggs glanced at him, then back at me. "This is personal," he said. Calder stepped closer, his hand easy near his belt. "Not anymore. You bring trouble to this ridge, it becomes my concern." The standoff held a long moment. Then Briggs looked past us both toward the window, where Miriam now stood plain in sight. "You can't hide forever," he called to her. Miriam didn't answer. She only met his gaze and then let the curtain fall. Calder told him to turn around and ride out. Briggs didn't move at first, but Frank shifted in the saddle rifle, resting across his lap. That seemed to change his mind. He mounted up slow and deliberate, then leaned forward in the saddle. "We'll cross paths again," he said to me. They rode off into the dusk, Calder and Frank trailing him far enough to see him clear out of the ridge road. When Calder came back, he told me Briggs was likely headed toward the old mining trail. where a man could disappear for a while. But he'll circle back, the sheriff warned. Men like that always do. That night, we barred the doors and kept a lantern burning in the front room. I sat by the window until well after midnight, the cold seeping through the glass. Miriam sat across from me, sewing without looking down, her fingers moving on memory alone. Annie fell asleep on the couch, her head against her mother's side. When I finally stepped out for air, the stars were sharp and close, the kind you only see on the coldest nights. Somewhere far off, a coyote called and another answered. I knew the quiet wouldn't hold. The next move would come soon, and it wouldn't be on our terms. By the third day, the ridge was quiet again. The frost had softened under the pale sun, and the pines whispered in a wind that felt more like winter than fall. Sheriff Calder rode up late in the morning, his horse's breath hanging in the cold air. He brought word that Briggs had been found down near the river bend, trying to cross before the thaw came. A posse had caught him, no gun drawn, no fight left in him. Calder said the circuit judge would be in town before the week was out, and Briggs would stand trial under the eyes of men who'd known his kind before. Miriam stood beside me, hands folded in her shawl. She didn't speak, but I saw her shoulders ease just a little. Annie stayed near the porch rail, watching the sheriff ride off toward town. The air felt different after that, still cold, but without that edge of waiting for trouble. 2 days later, we made the trip into town for the hearing. The courthouse smelled of wood smoke and paper, the benches creaking under the weight of neighbors who'd come to see it through. Briggs kept his eyes low as the charges were read. He didn't speak in his defense. The judge's gavel sounded once sharp and final. When it was over, we stepped outside into the pale noon light. Miriam stood for a long moment on the steps, breathing deep as if the air itself was new to her. Annie slipped her hand into mine, her grip warm against the chill. Back at the cabin, life settled into the kind of quiet that lets a man hear his own thoughts. The chores returned to their steady rhythm: wood to split, stock to feed, water to haul. Miriam began mending curtains for the front room, and Annie's laughter came easier now, ringing through the yard like it belonged there. Looking back, I reckon justice isn't always about the law alone. Sometimes it's in the way folks stand together when one of their own is threatened, or in the simple fact that a door stays open for those who've known too many locked ones. The land will test you, and so will people. But out here, a man learns that the measure of a home isn't just in the timber or the acres, it's in the hands that help keep it standing. If you've listened this far, maybe you've known your own kind of trial and found your own way through. Hold on to the folks who walk beside you. And if this story stays with you, pass it along. There's always someone who needs to hear it.